I'm guessing about a year later. I didn't actually save the recording dates on my Great Ace Attorney videos. I renamed them all. I decided to finally actually finish the playlist on the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. This is going to be very informal and very sloppy. So, I don't know. Uh, just don't take it, like a lot of what I say in this as gospel, right? I'm going to talk about a lot of things I don't know much about, not very educated in, um, and I could really, really easily make a mistake. I guess I'd like to start out with how good the game is. Um, so, just kind of like my own personal preference in stories, I what makes the best stories for me personally, what tickles my fancy is basically having some sort of plot twist where there were an awful lot of hints of that twist was going to occur or that the result of that twist was reality before you get to it. It's just because of the way they're presented, you don't necessarily pick up on them. And then when you the plot twist is finally revealed, it's like, oh, all that makes sense now. And it looks like it would have been obvious when you look at it in hindsight, but it wasn't in foresight. That's I like that the best, right? Um, Detective stories like murder mysteries, you can do something like that with, right? You want to have it so that maybe when they figure out who exactly the killer is, it wasn't necessarily obvious in foresight, but it looks like it should have been, given the clues that you collected, obvious in hindsight, and even obvious with the meta in hindsight. Um, and the whole mechanic where the game forces you to go through these kind of pseudo logical steps using the evidence that you've been collecting um, to work your way down to the organize. It's like mediates it for you. So you work your way yourself down to the conclusion of who did it. I really like that idea. And so I also like that too. Ace Attorney is good with like the logic, but isn't necessarily that good with the whole mind-blowing twist thing. Um, because Ace Attorney doesn't really focus so much on the overarching story of the whole game, and tends to be more episodic. And I say too much on because most Ace Attorney games do have some overarching story. They have some sort of through line mystery that goes from each of the chapters, and you do solve that a little by little as you go through the chapters. With the Great Ace Attorney, you do have each chapter little by little. It has something to do with the overarching mystery of what happened um, to Kazuma's father, because what happened to Kazuma's father um, is related to this whole hostage exchange phenomena, in that in both these cases, Lord Strongheart is the bad guy. So, the first case, Jaziel Brett is one of the assassins, not hostage exchange, assassins exchange, sorry, one of the assassins in the assassins exchange. And what we are investigating is one of the assassinations that she performed. The second case involves Soseki and his lodgings, which are important because that is where the dog collar for the hound that the prosecutor, Von Zeeks, right? His brother used to carry out the Reaper of the Bailey revenge killings. So, and it introduced, it introduced some characters like Miss Green, which will be relevant later when you finally solve that. the Magnus McGilded case was relevant because it had to do with the exchange of government secrets for money, the government secrets being exchanged, specifically being information about the assassin exchange. And revisiting that in chapter 5 of the first game, you basically go back to the whole Magnus McGilded thing. That's when you finally reveal that. And then the first case, the second game is kind of filler, but it also, again, has to do with Jeziel Brett and the assassin exchange, right? The second case, you learn about the Baskervilles collar. The third case, you learn that Kazuma's father was shot after raising out of his grave afterwards, and the story of the professor, which is implied to be Kazuma's father, right? In the last case, it all unravels. So each one of those cases has something to do with this big overall mystery. But you still don't really focus on you don't really feel the pressure of the big overall mystery that well. The game's not really good at making you feel that pressure. And most of the focus generally tends to be on each individual case. Earlier Ace Attorney cases of games like Ace Attorney 2, for example, were very episodic in nature. They didn't really build too much. Ace Attorney 1 built up a little more, but it was still mainly very episodic. As we get to later games like Apollo Justice, which is actually written by a different author, I think, than these, things started to get more overarching. Anyway, so because I like those big overarching things, you get little hints of as you go along. Ace Attorney is not really the best. It's not necessarily, I don't like it as much as, say, like an Uchikoshi game or a Kodaka game. However, this game, as far as like Ace Attorney series are concerned, is relatively good in that respect. A big problem with it, though, was how obvious it was, overarchingly. It was even a cover art spoiler. I don't know what game developers are thinking when they do cover art spoilers. Who likes that? Why does anybody think in any sort of corporate meeting that's a good idea? But it's pretty obvious that Lord Strongheart is the big bad somehow or other. And because of that, you don't really feel, the mystery isn't really felt that well because of the obviousness of it. But Ace Attorney does have good good logic puzzles that are pretty enjoyable. And so I kind of like Ace Attorney. This is the downside compared to other series of Japanese visual novels. It's just the whole pressure of the situation in Ace Attorney is really hard to feel just because of how casual the game feels due to the casualness of the characters. They made scenarios and scenes in Ace Attorney that seem to be really high pressure, like, for example, the second case of the very first game. But the game isn't written in such a way that really makes you feel it. And so it's kind of like this light-hearted casual murder. And I tend to be more into the heart-pounding excitement kind of things. And lastly, they tend to draw stuff out kind of annoyingly in Ace Attorney, especially in the trials. Like, for example, the prosecutor would say, well, how could the knife couldn't have stabbed into Miss Green's back because, well, she would have been standing there. Like, it went into her, if it fall from above, how does it go into her back? And instead of you just retorting, well, it's because she was bending over, you go, oh no, my argument is completely dead. I'll slam my face on the table. What do I do? And then like your assistant says something to kind of encourage you. And the judge is like, if you can't present a challenge, this completely destroys your argument. If you cannot present a challenge to this defense, then I will declare guilty, which in this case wasn't the case because of the jury, but whatever. And it's just like, eventually what he's going to say, but you have to go through all this rigmarole to get to saying it's because she bent over to pick up a book, right? It gets a bit silly there, right? You can't just go through the logic and necessarily the pace you want to. And the summation examinations definitely added a lot to this text bloat and seemed to make you have to go through a lot more in the trials just to get through them, and the game have much longer play time than it should. I really hated those. So summation examinations is not a highly esteemed gameplay mechanic in my book. And so generally these Ace Attorney trials seem to just take longer than they really need to get to the point. And I had a hard time rewatching this footage back of my Let's Play to do this video because it was really boring to me. Sometimes I actually get sucked into my old Let's Plays and I actually get sucked in to watching myself in certain games. But in this one, no. So I can understand if this whole Great Ace Attorney Let's Play would have been really, really boring, because it's pretty boring to watch someone to play this, to be honest. You have a lot of skipping you need to do. Anyway. So, yeah, like I like games better that are more like invest in the overall plot and are more suspenseful and weird and twisty. But I still like Ace Attorney. The only two games besides this series I haven't played, as I said at the beginning, are, at least all the way through, are Ace Attorney Investigations Miles Edgeworth 2. Not necessarily haven't played or haven't seen someone else play it. I saw someone play like the first part of the first trial of the first case. There isn't really trials and investigations, Miles Edgeworth. But that's very minimal. So I theoretically could play that one blind. It would make sense. It is one of those weird fan translation, apply it things. I'd rather, if we can play it in English, I'd rather play it in English. There might be some copyright issues there that I have to wait for the statutes of limitations to run out on before I show my face on my channel. Just kidding. So that's kind of complicated. The other one is Dual Destinies. So anyway, if I want to do more Ace Attorney, that's what I do. Not really. There's much more things I'm excited about right now than Ace Attorney. So those are like way down at the bottom of the list, way down on the back burner, you could say. Not if you were excited to see me play more Ace Attorney for some reason, I have to disappoint you. I won't really pick up on those really fast. That's like if I ran out of anything else to do, because stuff I just like better than Ace Attorney. Anyway, I tried to go back through and and log for each segment for which you have the same, throughout that segment you have the same health pool, which ones I succeeded in getting through without running out of health, and which ones I didn't. But I kind of skimmed through my boring Let's Play, and I used the chapter select to help me with this. And so I might have made some mistakes in here. I didn't do this too rigorously because I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. Generally, when there's like an intermission or recession in the middle of a day of trial, when you come back from the recess or the intermission, or like what you could call it, the defendant's law reconversation, you get health again. But if it's just a to be continued, it looks like you don't. So when I say session 1 and session 2 here, what I'm referring to is just before the recess and after the recess. So what really got me was after the recess on chapter 3, I messed that up. It had something to do with finding blood stains in the omnibus or something. And then I had a hard time with chapter 5 of the first game as well. Session 2 of chapter 5, I tried to game it, tried to mess with save files in a way that looked like I didn't really fail and ran out of health. But I would have if I hadn't saved, and it's kind of cheating. So I just put it down as a failure. It doesn't really look like that much of a failure on recording, though, the way I managed to finagle it. And then after that, I was just like, well, the second game, I'll get through this without running out of health. Because I kind of expected to be able to do that, because I watched Lucajin, and she can go through Ace Attorney games without messing up, running out of health, and saving. Like, she somehow was good enough to do that reliably every time. So when I run out of health in an Ace Attorney game trying to record it, it's like feels real bad because I feel like really inferior. So I managed to get through like the first half of chapter 3 on the second game, and then I went to play the second half, the second day of the third case, which was the instantaneous kinesis case in the second game. These are hard to say, and I just got destroyed. Just wiped me out. So I managed to get there, and then that one just destroyed me. It would be. that is one I might actually want to watch somebody else. I haven't watched somebody else Let's Play the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles yet. Something I might want to watch someone else play is that chapter. See what happens. And Nico B's done it. I think he might have done like a fan translation or something. Because he had the fan translation for the first game. Just watched the first couple minutes to know that. So I might have done the fan translation for the second game. The fan translation translates the names differently than the official one is, because they're trying to just do like the same names as in Japanese. They're not trying to remake them into a pun that English speakers can understand. When Capcom commercially translates Ace Attorney into English, they redo the names to like make new name puns. So that name translation isn't very faithful usually. Apparently, also Sherlock Holmes is still Sherlock Holmes in the Japanese. The Sherlock Holmes thing is an English only thing. And then I messed up a lot on the last case, which is chapters 4 and 5 of the second case. I tried not to, but it just got me. Another thing I like to tabulate. So again, this may not be the right breakdown of same health bar sessions. So it might be wrong, because I did this really fast and sloppy. So don't take it as gospel. And then another thing I like to grade myself on is who I thought was the culprit going into the trial and whether or not that was right or not. So at the beginning of the game, I didn't bother, which I guess was okay because that character hadn't been introduced yet. The culprit was introduced mid-trial, so I guess that's fine. Chapter 3 of the first game also just jumped right into a trial, and I also didn't bother. Of course, you could have bothered because Magnus McGilded, who was the actual culprit, was introduced to you going in. So you did have that person to guess if that person looked suspicious enough right away, and they did look pretty suspicious. But I didn't bother to guess, so I can't give myself any credit. Chapter 4, the first trial, I didn't make any predictions at the beginning of the trial, but in the recess, I said, I think it's probably William Shakespeare. Of course, he wasn't named at the time, so I said, like, the guy who was quoting Shakespeare that we encountered in the street. Of course, that was wrong. It was Joanne Garadeb by accident. And Rolly Beat also was involved in it because he also committed the crime of tampering with the crime scene. So you end up pinning both of them with something. But Joanne Garadeb was the person with the kill. I'm proud of this guess that it being William Shakespeare. The problem was it was just wrong. That was actually that was honestly the author preparing for the second game already. Which is good. I like it, the continuity, how he was like preparing for the sequel before he did the sequel, and he knew what he was going to do for the sequel in the process of writing the first game. It was all pre-planned. That's good writing. Why? This doesn't look anything like how you would write unnamed. Like, it's not even close. Unnamed. And this doesn't look anything like William. Anyway, I don't know what happened with my typing there. So, and then I just kept guessing William Shakespeare throughout the rest of the first game, just because he was like, the Chekhov's gun had to fire. So I guess William Shakespeare again in chapter 5. And who actually did it, of course, was Ashley Graydon, who introduced himself as Eggert Benedict. And I said something like, my first choice is William Shakespeare, my second choice is Eggert Benedict, but second choices don't count. So first game, chapter 2, I didn't guess. No, second game, chapter 1. Sorry, game 2, chapter 1, I didn't guess because we just jumped right into it without any information. It turned out to be a character that wasn't introduced until midway through the trial, so you wouldn't be able to guess them anyway, named Righton Mini Mimo. And then I tried to be thorough about watching this, but at the first day of trial for chapter 2 of game 2, I don't recall finding myself make a prediction, so I think I just forgot. If you were to go back and watch that footage and say, no, you actually did make a prediction on the first day of trial for chapter 2 of game 2, you can correct me. But I didn't find one. I may have made a mistake in not finding it, but I didn't find one. But so I guess I forgot to. Of course, who did it was Olive Green. And then at the beginning of the second trial, I did guess Olive Green, and I was correct. Second day of trial. And then chapter 3, I guessed Madame Tussbells going into day 1 of the trial. And I guessed Enoch Drebber going into the second day of the trial. It was really a lame guess, but I mean, if you would have guessed Eggert Benedict for chapter 5 of the first game, which would have been a lame guess in that case, you would have been correct. So just because a guess is lame doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. So it wasn't necessarily a bad guess, but it turned out being Courtney Scythe. And that Courtney Scythe was only introduced between day 1 of trial and day 2 of trial. So you wouldn't be able to guess her before day 1, but you could have guessed her before day 2. I would have thought she would have been maybe a later game. I didn't guess her because I thought she would have been something who would be the culprit in like a later part of the game. So, but this was going on in my head. I don't think I said it, but that's what was going on in my head at the time. Kind of a shame I got that one wrong though. And then for chapter 4, I guessed it would be Daily Vigil because we didn't actually see him. He was just a person who was missing, right? I presume he would be introduced mid-trial, and then he would be the culprit. And he was introduced mid-trial, but he wasn't the culprit. And then for day 2, for chapter 5, which is the same case, A New Day, I guess Kazuma is the one who killed Inspector Gregson. It turned out to be wrong. It turned out to be Seijiro Jigoku, and I was really disappointed about that. Anyway, so if I were to give myself like an A, B, C, D rating of how well I did at like my gameplay performance, I would say here this is like a C because you get it's like a C, and then this is like an F. I only got one right, and that was Olive Green. So one right out of I guess 9 cases. No, there's 8 cases, 8 trials is terrible. If you count the ones that discount the ones that you jump right into a trial, like the first chapters or the third chapter of the first game, that is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 out of 5, which is still 20%. It's still really bad. And that guess for Olive Green was on the second day of trial when that character was introduced and we knew about her for the first day of trial. So basically, just the worst possible score besides a 0. The only way I could do worse than this was get none of them right. Okay, now I have to go into kind of the silly part. So, this game is trying to be somewhat of a homage to its roots, right? This is a detective novel. Ace Attorney is a detective novel style thing. And I know the character you're playing as, their title is an attorney. But what they actually do is more the role of a detective in a detective story than an attorney. So it's going to be more like a detective game than like a Grisham sort of story. So and it's playing a homage to Sherlock Holmes, which is an early and groundbreaking detective story set of literature, right? By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It started up in around 1887, right? Yeah. And he lived till about 1930. And he was born in 1959 or something like that off the top of my head. And so it got me thinking about the whole subject of what's like the history, what's the origin of the development of the detective story. Because it would be really hard to say that say something is like the first detective story, because you can imagine someone wrote something kind of like a detective story, and then like it slowly kind of evolved to its modern form, each literature writer building on the foundation of previous writers, right? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle built off of some stuff that was written by Edgar Allan Poe, for example, back earlier in the 1800s. So it's kind of like, this is inspired by that, inspired by that. Maybe Sherlock Holmes was one of the first, like, proper full-blown detective stories, set of full-blown detective stories, like there's a certain kind of, it's like the invention of the modern bassoon. There existed things called the bassoon before then, but that's the invention of the modern one. Just to give an analogy. An analogy to Heckle, right? Like, Heckle didn't invent the bassoon. Actually, probably didn't invent any bassoon. There's a bunch of business drama there, but invented the modern one. But what's kind of like the first kind of remnants, the first kind of like notion, the development in human history of the detective story? And sort of on that note, kind of also maybe the court story. And potentially also, we can make this all about the type of visual novels I like to read. The whole mystery story in general, where you have all these weird subtle hints and something that doesn't seem quite right, and there's plot tension, and suddenly there's a big twist and it's all revealed. Like, what's the kind of origin of that kind of story, where you kind of like put together the puzzle pieces and they all fit together in the end, and you do the inductive reasoning. It's a big aha, right? Puzzle stories, you could say. And I kind of asked my mom about this. She likes detective stories. Asked my sister about this because she almost got a degree in English from college and decided to fail every class in the very last semester when she would have graduated. I don't get it, but very close. She studied that a lot. And I didn't really get an answer, but later on, I was, reading about, the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls and junk, because I like to read about Bible stuff quite often. And I started learning about two stories. For some reason, I'm not as prepared as I want to be here. So one of them is called The History of Susanna, or The Story of Susanna and the Elders. And the other one, History of Susanna is what it's called. The other one is, come on here, Belle and the Dragon. Okay. Now to kind of explain what these are. Well, no, I don't. I just have to say that I came across them, right? And at the time I Googled, what is the earliest detective story, or what's like the origin of a mystery story. I didn't really get anything. But today I actually Googled that again, and Wikipedia page for that actually comes up with these as candidates. So I'm not the first person with this idea. This is something that's well talked about. It's sort of like early versions of sort of like the detective type like story sort of cropping up, or like early versions of what would eventually evolve in the contemporary era to be something like Ace Attorney. If you want to reach back, though, something you might think of as Sophocles, right? Sophocles was an ancient Greek drama playwright who wrote this kind of goofy play at around 429 BC. We're doing Bible stuff here, so we're going to hear a lot of BC and AD. Okay, what's a common era? I don't even know. Anyway, basically this man called Oedipus, his parents took him to an oracle to ask the oracle about his future. And the oracle said that he would murder his father and marry his mother. And so they sent him away because they didn't want him to murder the father. They tried to defeat the fate. Well, it turns out that he was just the adopted son of his parents. They weren't his real parents. And so sending him away didn't do anything. He ended up actually murdering his real father and marrying his real mother. And I don't know if we can necessarily call that a mystery or a detective story, because I guess you could wonder how exactly he murders his father and he marries his mother. But in the story, he murders somebody and then he marries somebody, right? He marries the queen of some place, and that makes him the king. That's why the title of the play is Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex. So you would presume that the person he kills, which he gets in some altercation on the street and kills, and the person he marries are his father and his mother. It's not really that mysterious. It's pretty obvious. So I don't know if it necessarily qualifies that much as a mystery story. And you could go through like other works by Sophocles and try to find, or other Greek playwrights, try to go through ancient Greek stuff and find one. I haven't really gone through that much because I'm not really as into ancient Greek stuff that much. But that does predate, may actually predate Susanna and the Elders or Bel and the Dragon. So it's definitely, the Greek dramas are definitely very big landmarks in the history of literature. They're definitely, we definitely go back to them and use them as inspirations for our stuff in the modern era. They're big advances, big displays of the science of story writing. But I don't know if we can necessarily consider them like precursors of the mystery story, just the precursors of stories, which I guess makes you the precursor of a mystery story just because they're stories. Wow, I wasn't making a lot of sense there, was I? I guess, well, but, so now, once I'm done talking about Oedipus and stuff, I guess I should, in my disorganized and scrambled fashion that I'm talking in this whole time, explain what the Susanna and the Elders, or Bel and the Dragon, are. So, the Bible, I talk about the ancient Hebrew Bible. When the Greeks conquered Palestine, when they conquered Israel, they brought their culture down into Palestine, and Greek sort of became a trade language of that region. And the Jews knew how to speak Greek, learned how to speak Greek, and they would probably have Greek proselytes as well. And Greek was still like a big trade language in the Roman Empire after the Romans conquered Palestine too. I've heard it said that probably, like, you know how the Passion of the Christ has Pilate talking to Jesus in Jewish Aramaic and Jesus talking to Pilate in Latin? I've heard it said that probably they would talk to each other in Greek. Like, the Romans and the Jews would use Greek as sort of a pigeon language between them. That would be more historically accurate. Anyway, the Jews knew how to speak Greek, and they wanted to spread their literature, wanted to spread the Jewish Bible to those who could speak Greek, right? And so the Jewish people translated the Jewish Bible during the Hellenistic period when they were under the rule of the Greek Empire into Greek. And they have a legend about this, the legend of the Septuagint, that they put 72 people in separate rooms, each tasked with translating the Jewish Bible into Greek, and the entire thing, and they all came back with exactly the same translation. And due to that legend, that's why the abbreviation, usually in footnotes, for the Septuagint is LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70. Now I go, 72 people, 70, how does that make sense? I don't know what happened to those other two people. But the nickname for the Septuagint is the 70, and the word Septuagint, sept, which is like Greek for, or is it Roman? Roman for 7? Anyway, that goes into the name the Septuagint. It means the 70. This was not actually how it was translated, at least not evangelicalism. At least I don't believe this is how the Septuagint was actually translated. It was translated slowly over time, book by book, starting with the Pentateuch in organized fashion, or the Torah, as they would have called it, probably as an organized project, and then the prophets and the writings would have been done afterward, maybe a bit more casually. So they would have started it, in the I guess like the 3rd century BC, and then they would finish it more in the 2nd century BC. Over like tens of years, it slowly would have gotten done. And this is, I guess, the Greek Bible, the Greek New Old Testament. This is how the early church fathers of the Christian church would have, communicated the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible to those they were evangelizing or those they were proselytizing in the Roman Empire. This was this Greek Bible, this Greek Old Testament, and this Greek Old Testament would be associated with Christianity. There would be kind of like a rift where, like the Hebrew, the original Hebrew Old Testament or Hebrew Bible would be associated with the Jews and the Greek one with the Christians. So an important, one of the one of the books of the Bible translated that is kind of what I'm trying to focus in on here is the book of Daniel, which would have been one of the later ones to be translated into Greek, probably in the 2nd century BC or the 100s BC. And I noticed that that something to note is that the Septuagint version, this so-called or Old Greek version of the translation from Daniel into Greek, it's almost lost because it appears the early Christian church didn't consider it a very faithful translation, and they tossed it, and they used a different scholar's translation from the Hebrew at a much later date, translated it in about 150 A.D., called the Theodosian translation. And so if I were to guess, again, I'm not an expert on this, you don't take this as gospel, the version of the book of Daniel in Greek that you'd find in these great codices commissioned by Constantine, like the Codex Vaticanus or the Codex Sinaiticus, they're the Theodosian versions of Daniel. And there's only 2 fragments of the book of Daniel. I think they're called the Codex Shinianus and the papyrus number 967 or something like that actually preserve the LXX version of Daniel. So the LXX version of Daniel, I guess, was kind of a really bad translation of Daniel. And the translators interjected 3 additional stories, actually. One of them I'm not going to mention here because talk about too much here because it's a prayer. It's a prayer made by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. But the other 2 are kind of important for the origin, kind of interesting when you're talking about Ace Attorney. These stories that we're pretty sure were not in the original Jewish Aramaic book of Daniel, but are in the Greek Septuagint. So there are some copies of Daniel that were found in the Qumran caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Dead Sea Scrolls, are somewhere around, the 2nd, 3rd century BC. And they do not contain these stories that are in the Septuagint. Neither does the Theodosian. Neither does the Masoretic text. So I might be getting far away from the microphone. Sorry about that, going through all of that. So it suggests that those are just some folk tales, some sort of oral passed down stories about Daniel or Belteshazzar, that the Jewish people had that somehow got stuck into the LXX by a rather not very conservative scribe, that were not in the Jewish Aramaic text of Daniel. So we, Christians like me, tend to assume that they are probably works of fiction, which makes them count in this category of detective stories or mystery stories, because I presume we want to look at fiction, right? So we would, most like everybody today, no matter regardless of the religion they follow, would probably consider these two stories to be works of fiction. Historicity is doubtful. Some sort of notes about translating the Bible and languages and whatnot. As far as I understand it, when the Jews would copy the Jewish Bible, so the law, the prophets, and the writings, they had a tendency to destroy the old copies after they made a new copy. The reason being they were afraid that as old copies decayed, the text in them would become less and less legible. And that would increase the probability of introducing a mistake when copying them. So after a text got so old, they would destroy it to try to avoid somebody, I guess, accidentally trying to copy from that text and making a mistake copying it, or going back and like misreading and go, hey, looks like there was a mistake in the copying because this old text says something different than the new text, when actually the old text doesn't. It's just wear and tear on the old text and decreasing legibility, and the person just got it wrong. They want to avoid that way of messing up and getting it wrong. So they would destroy old copies of their scriptures. When we try to go back and do our textual criticism of the Bible, though, we like to dig up old manuscripts to look for not like little due to wear changes, like little dots, pieces of letters, but look for big changes potentially in the Bible over time. This is somewhat frustrating, and it made it such that the Masoretic text, like the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible we have, which I guess is called the Leningrad Codex, dates to around 1000 AD, which isn't really that old. There's some fragments down into like the 800s, but there's just fragments down to the 800s. So when, until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s, the oldest copy of the Jewish Aramaic and also ancient Hebrew copies of the Bible, at least the Old Testament of the Bible, or the Jewish Bible. The Old Testament and the Jewish Bible are the same, they're just arranged in different order. That's all. Same text. Was like Dark Ages. It was actually written, it was like in the 800s. It was pretty young. Whereas there are copies of the Jewish Bible translated into Greek that were in the great codices, like the Codex Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, that were in the 300s AD. Those, I presume, were commissioned by Constantine. So we had much older copies of the Greek than we had of the Hebrew. The book of Daniel was written in called Jewish Aramaic. When the Jews went to Babylon for the captivity, they tended to pick up the Aramaic language, and so the Aramaic language is very similar to ancient Hebrew, but it's not exactly the same. And so, the Hebrew that the Torah was written in wasn't exactly the same way that people spoke to each other on a day-to-day basis in the time of Jesus, just for reference. But going to the history of Hebrew was a little bit too much here for my application. We had much older copies in Greek than we had in Hebrew. And so you could say, well, the Septuagint or the Laodicean, these Greek copies of the Hebrew Bible could accrue more errors than the Hebrew Bible because of the translation, because that language transfer, you get errors in translation. However, they were early, we had copies of them earlier in time, so we are less susceptible to change with time and copying, giving it some credibility. And it turns out that you can't just simply say, well, because the Septuagint is a translation, it probably it's less useful for textual criticism, or less useful for telling us how to write an English Bible than the Masoretic text. There are sometimes cases where the Septuagint is actually more accurate than the Masoretic text, likely. One of the examples of that is the age of antediluvian man, which means before the Great Deluge. There's a genealogy, Genesis 4, that describes, what age each of the fathers in the line from Adam to Noah gave birth to their son, which was next in line, and how long they lived. This happens to not be in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls copies of Genesis. There's Genesis scrolls, but apparently by coincidence, somehow Genesis chapter 4 tends to always be lost. The genealogy tends to be lost. They are part of the scrolls that are not preserved. So all we really have with this genealogy is things like, the Masoretic text, the Vulgate, the Septuagint, and the Syriac, and stuff like that. In the Masoretic text, a lot of the age at which they have a son, the begetting ages in the genealogy are lower by exactly 100 years. Like they chopped off the first digit in the Masoretic text compared to the Septuagint. Now, when we discover the Masoretic text, and also influenced by the Reformation, there's a tendency, because there was not a language change from the Masoretic text, it was written in the original language, to trust, and addition to a specific error, was to trust the Masoretic text over the Septuagint. The error was the way that the dates, the ages work in the Septuagint suggests that Methuselah survived the flood somehow. Survived the Great Deluge. He lived through the Great Deluge, which doesn't make any sense given the Great Deluge narrative. And that's not that error. That's not the case in the ages presented in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text. So, but if you go back and you look at other ancient witnesses, other people who wrote stuff down, wrote historical accounts, like back to the time of Josephus, we now know that likely actually most of the begetting ages given in the Septuagint are actually the correct ones. So despite the translation, the Septuagint was actually correct. And the error that made it look like Methuselah lived through the flood because it was probably just a copying mistake. And it's completely independent to how the begetting ages are 100 years off in the Masoretic text. We don't know why the 100 years are dropped, like there was a 100-year subtraction in the Masoretic text. Christians like to point fingers at the Jews and claim they did it on purpose to try to make the antediluvian timeline shorter, something to do with the 7 weeks of Daniel, and I don't really get it, and I don't know who's right, and I don't know if we should be playing this blame game. Anyway, so sometimes the Septuagint, is useful. It's not, and it's good that we have it. Anyway. So let me actually kind of read these, and you'll see why I wanted to read these on an Ace Attorney video. I'm going to try to read like an English translation of the old Greek, like the oldest version of these stories found in the oldest manuscripts of the LXX of Daniel here. So let me try to pull it up. So here's Susanna first. There dwelt a man in Babylon. His name was Joachim. And he took a wife whose name was Susanna, the daughter of Helkias, a very fair woman, and one that feared the Lord. So this is a lowercase Lord, so I presume this is Adonai. Her parents also were righteous and taught their daughter according to the law of Moses. Now Joachim was a great rich man and had a fair garden joining onto his house. And to him resorted the Jews because he was more honorable than all others. And the same year, there were appointed two of the elders of the people to be judges, concerning whom the Lord had spoken when he said that antiquity went forth from Babylon. Iniquity went forth from Babylon through elder judges who were thought worthy to govern the people. So I guess, okay. And when he says in italics, which I presume means that that's implied. And cases from other cities also came before them for decision. So we got some Jewish elders to form as substitutes for the Babylonian ones. Okay, this isn't very realistic, but continue. Now, these men observed a woman of beautiful form, the wife of one of their own brother Israelites, who was called Susanna, daughter of Helkias, wife of Joachim, as she walked about in her husband's garden at eventide, were inflamed with love for her, and they perverted their mind and turned their eyes so as neither to look towards heaven nor to be mindful of right decisions. And though both were smitten by desire of her, yet each concealed from the other the evil that possessed them in regard to her, neither was the woman aware of this matter. Man, this is written so awkwardly. And as soon as it was daylight, they came stealthily, evading each other, hurrying to see which should be first to show himself to her, and to speak with her. And behold, she was taking her walk, according to her wont. And one elder had barely arrived, when lo, the other came up. Then one began to cross-examine his fellow, demanding, Why art thou forth so very early, leaving me behind? With that they made confession to each other of his painful state. Then said the one to the other, Let us repair to her. And having agreed together on a plan, they made advance to her and sought to constrain her. Man, this is such a weird old English way of translating this. But the daughter of Judah answered them, I know that if I do this, it is death to me. And if I do it not, I shall not escape from your hands. Yet it better for me not to do this and to fall into your hands, rather than to sin before the Lord. So I don't know what their plan was, but apparently, if she refused, she might die. That's something to do with their plan, I guess. So these transgressors of the law turned away, vowing vengeance and planning together how they might put her to death. And they came into the synagogue of the city in which they dwelt. And there were assembled in council all Israelites of the place. Then the two elders and judges arose and said, Send for Susanna, daughter of Helkias, the same who is the wife of Joachim. And straightway they summoned her. And when the woman appeared with her father and mother, her bondmen and her bondwomen, to the number of 500, also presented themselves, as well as the 4 little children of Susanna. Wow, okay. I don't want to make a comment there. Now the woman was very delicate, yet the lawless pair ordered that she should be unveiled, that they might sate themselves with the beauty of her attraction. Whereat all her attendants and all who knew her began to weep. Then arose the elders and judges and laid their hands upon her head. But her heart was stayed upon the Lord her God, and looking upon, she wept within herself, saying, O Lord, the eternal God, who dwellest all things before they come into being, thou knowest that I have not done what these lawless men maliciously allege against me. And the Lord hearkened to her entreaty. Then the 2 elders affirmed, We were walking about in her husband's garden. And as we came around the stadium, we saw this woman dallying with a man. We stood still and observed them consorting each other. So you, voyeurized? But they were not aware that we were standing by. Then, when each of us had confirmed the other, we said, we must find out who these persons are. So we came forward, and her we recognized, but the young man escaped us, being concealed by a mask. This is so weird. And having arrested her, why would he wear a mask? I don't know. And having arrested her, we put the question, who is the fellow? But she refused to tell us who he was. These things we declare as witnesses, and the whole synagogue believed them, inasmuch as they were elders and judges of the people. And as she was being led away to be destroyed, behold, there came an angel of the Lord, as it had been commanded him. The angel bestowed a spirit of discernment upon a young man, this being Daniel. Then, separating the crowd, Daniel stations himself in the midst of them and said, Are ye so foolish, O sons of Israel, that without examination and knowledge of the truth you have condemned the daughter of Israel to die? Now therefore take these men apart from each other, that I may cross-examine them. And when they were separated, Daniel said to the synagogue, Now consider not that these men are elders or say they can never be false, but I will examine them with reference to that which is suggested to me. See, this isn't really a mystery story. They tell you what's going on up front, but it is a very Ace Attorney-like thing, right? You got to cross-examine you have two witnesses, and he says you shouldn't just take the witnesses at their word. You need to cross-examine them. This principle is like the underpinning of Ace Attorney. This is what this Ace Attorney is all about. You don't just take the witnesses at what they say. You need to stop and cross-examine them. And when they were separated, Daniel said to the synagogue, Now consider not that these men are elders, nor say they can never... Okay, yeah. And he summoned one of the two. So they brought forward the elder before the young man. Now, Daniel, or Belteshazzar, is kind of a Babylonian judge, because he's appointed by Babylon to be a judge. Now, he is Jewish though, so he is a Jew, but he's appointed by Babylon to be a judge. Anyway, and he summoned one of the two, so they brought forward the elder before the young man. Then said Daniel to him, Hearken, hearken, thou ancient of evil days. Now, have overtaken thee thy sins which thou hast committed in time past. Being trusted to hear and to decide capital cases, thou hast both condemned the innocent and hast acquitted the guilty. Although the Lord saith, the innocent and the righteous slay thou not. Now therefore, under that what tree, and at what sort of place in the garden thou hast seen them together? The impicious man answered, Under a mastic tree. Then said the youth, Right. Well hast thou borne false witness against thine own soul, for the angel of the Lord will cleave thy soul this day. Then removing the one he gave command to bring the other before him, to whom he said, Wherefore is the seed that is in thee become perverted as that of Sidon, and not as that of Judah? Beauty has beguiled thee, base passion. Even so were you wont to do with daughters of Israel, who through their fear accompanied with you, but a daughter of Judah scorned to endure your pestilent license. Now therefore tell me, under what tree and in which spot of the enclosure didst thou detect them consorting together? Who answered, Under a holm tree. Who answered, Under a holm tree. Then said Daniel, Thou sinner! Even now the angel of the Lord is standing with drawn sword, till the people shall make an end of thee, that he may cut thee to pieces. Then the whole synagogue shouted aloud in praise of the young man, because from their own mouth he had proved them both to be confessed false witnesses. And they dealt with them according to the law, according as the law prescribes, doing to them just as they maliciously intended against their sister. So when they had gagged them, they led them out and hurled them into a chasm, which is kind of how you start a stoning process. Then the angel of the Lord cast fire in the midst of them, and thus was innocent blood kept safe on that day. For in this case the young men are beloved by Jacob by reason of their sincerity. And as for us, let us watch over young men, that they may become men of worth. For so young men will be God-fearing, and there shall be in them a spirit of knowledge and discernment forever and ever. a bit weird. Um, so anyway, that's like the beginning of that's like the concept of Ace Attorney. Now you can kind of go back and say cutting the woman in half, go back to cutting the baby in half kind of thing. But if we want to go deeper, there are like a so quite a bit different version showed up of this in the Theodosian. Um, but it wasn't. It isn't in the Hebrew anyway. Um, I'll just read the OG version because OG is OG. OG stands for Old Greek. Apparently the original LXX. That's the older one, right? That's the oldest version we have. I'm going for oldness. Um, anyway, the second story is Bel and the Dragon. So we'll see what this is the first time I'm reading this, by the way. This is blind. Um, so I'm going to read it. Not blind. I've read like summaries of these. I haven't read like the actual like text of them. So blind's not the right term. So next one. See how this one is and how this is sort of like early Ace Attorney. From the prophecy of Habakkuk, the son of Jesus of the tribe of Levi, which they translate that because it's Greek, right? You could say the son of Joshua or Ishua probably. Um, Joshua is a very common ancient Jewish name, and the Greek form of it is Jesus. I don't know if that's how they pronounced it in Greek. Maybe the Romans would have pronounced it Jesus, so maybe the Greek form was more like Jesus. There was a certain man, a priest by name Daniel, son of Abel, a companion of the king of Babylon. And there was an idol, Bel, who the Babylonians worshipped, and they expended on him daily 12 artabas of fine wheaten flour and 4 sheep and 6 measures of oil. The king also used to worship him, and the king used to go daily to do homage to him. And Daniel used to pray to Adonai. So the king said to Daniel, "Why bowest thou not to Bel?" And then Daniel said to the king, "None do I worship save the Lord, the God, who created the heaven and earth, even him who has sovereignty over all flesh." So Lord tends to be Adonai, God tends to be Elohim, generally. And the king said to him, unless it's all uppercase Lord, but you don't find that in Daniel. So, then Daniel said to the king, "None do I worship save." Okay, I already read that part. Even him. Then the king said to him, "Is this then not a god? Dost thou not see how much is spent on him daily?" Daniel therefore said to him, "Let no one by any means mislead thee by false reasoning, for this is within of clay and without of bronze, and I swear by the Lord, the God of gods, that this never did eat anything." So let me try to kind of explain it. What it means here is that they give this bread and food to the idol, like they place it before the idol, and when they go the next day to see back into the idol's chambers, it's gone, right? So it's like the idol is eating the food. Anyway. So the king became angry and summoned the overseers of the temple and said to them, "Show me who eats the things prepared for Bel, otherwise ye all die." Or, so we have a mystery now. We have a culprit. Who is eating the Bel's food? Or, if you do show that Bel devours them, Daniel, who alleges that these things are not eaten by him, shall die. But they said, it is Bel himself who devours these things. Then Daniel said to the king, let it be thus. If I shall show that it is not Bel who devours these things, let me suffer death together with all my friends. Wow, Daniel. Why are you roping all your other friends in for death? Why are you staking them? That's pretty cruel. Now, Bel had 70 priests besides their wives and children, meaning he had 70 priests and then including their wives and children even more. So they conducted the king into the idol temple. Then the food was laid out in the presence of the king and of Daniel, and mixed wine was brought on and set out for Bel. And Daniel said, thou myself seest that these things are in their places, O king. Do thou therefore seal the bolts of the temple when it is shut, and the entrance and the utterance please the king. Do thou therefore seal. Okay, so we're locking the room. Locked room mystery. Then Daniel ordered those with him to put out of the temple all the rest, and to besprinkle the temple with wood ashes. None of them outside the same knowing it. And then he shut the temple and gave orders to have it sealed with the king's signet ring and with the signet rings of certain priests of high rank, and this was done. And it came to pass in the morrow that they came back to the place, but the priests had, in the meantime, entered through secret doors and devoured all that had been placed before Bel and drunk up the wine. Yeah, ancient stuff they tend to tell you. They tend to solve it first. But we'll see the reasoning being done here. Then Daniel said, O priests, look at your seals, whether they remain intact, and do thou, O king, mark well whether anything has happened of which thou disapprovest. And they found the state of things as it was the day before, so they cast away the seals. But on opening the door, they saw that they had been that had been set out, what had been set out for Bel had been consumed, and that the tables were empty. The king accordingly rejoiced and said to Daniel, great is Bel, and with him is no deception. And Daniel laughed heartily, and said to the king, come, see the deception of the priests. Then Daniel said, O king, whose footprints are these? And the king said, those of men, women, and children. And he went to the house in which the priests resided, and found Bel's food, together with the wine. And Daniel showed the king the secret doors through which the priests entered, for the purpose of consuming what had been set before Bel. The king therefore led them out of Bel's temple, and delivered them up to Daniel. And what had been provided by purchase for him, he gave to Daniel, but Bel he destroyed. And there we go. Continuing. So, it's kind of like an early version of the locked room mystery. But it's basically solved by, there's footprints. I guess early version of finding footprints and locked room. Although very primitive kind of locked room. We didn't actually find the secret doors, did we? Now there was a dragon in the same place, and the Babylonians worshipped it. And the king said to Daniel, thou wilt thou say to this also, that it is bronze? Lo, thou livest, eatest, and drinkest. Do homage to him. But Daniel said, give me the power, and I will destroy the dragon without sword or staff. So the king conceded him do this, and he said, it is granted thee. Then Daniel took 30 minas of pitch, fat, and hair, and boiled them together and made a cake out of them, and threw it into the dragon's mouth. And after it had eaten the cake, it burst asunder. And he showed it to the king, saying, is it not the case that ye worship these fragments? Then there assembled against the king all the inhabitants of the country, and they said, the king has become a Jew. Bel he has overthrown, and slain the dragon. And when the king saw that the mob from the country had gathered against him, he called his companions and said, I give up Daniel to be destroyed. So there was a den in which 7 lions were kept, which, why is this so much a weird variation now? Those who plotted against the king used to be delivered up 2 bodies of persons condemned to death, being provided for them daily as food. So this doesn't seem to be a mystery story, really. So the crowds cast Daniel into the den, that he might be devoured and find no burial, and Daniel was in the lion's den 6 days. 6 days, holy smokes. That's longer than he was in the lion's den for praying. Now, and it happened on the 6th day that Habakkuk, who had wheaten loaves crumbled in a bowl, cooked, and an earthen jar of wine, and that he was proceeding into the field to the reapers. Then the angel of the Lord spake, because this is Old English, not Old English, early modern English, spake to Habakkuk, saying, says the Lord God to thee, the dinner which thou holdest, take it away to Daniel to the lion's den in Babylon. But Habakkuk said, O Lord God, I have not seen Babylon and the den. I do not know where it is. Then the angel of the Lord laid hold of Habakkuk by the hair of his head and set him over the den in Babylon. That must hurt. And Habakkuk said to Daniel, Arise and eat dinner which the Lord God has sent thee. Then said Daniel, Yea, for the Lord God hath forsaken not those who love him, has remembered me. So Daniel ate, and the angel of the Lord set Habakkuk down, whence he had taken him in the same day. But the Lord God remembered Daniel. Then the king, after these things, went forth, bewailing Daniel. As he stood to pry into the den, he saw him sitting there. So the king cried out and said, Great is the Lord God, and there is no other God besides him. And the king led Daniel out of the den, and those who have brought about his destruction were cast into the den in the presence of Daniel, and they were devoured. Okay, so, well, the whole dragon thing was kind of pointless. And that was definitely not, that the style of that was definitely did not match the rest of Daniel, and it was also quite absurd. So, yeah, it's quite absurd and crazy. But there we go. There we have some early examples of cross-examining the witness. Early examples of being a detective to detect down who was eating the food, I guess. Very early, very primitive, not even close to what we have today, any sort of notion. But maybe we're starting to see maybe something taking shape there around when the book of Daniel was put in the Septuagint, somewhere in the 100s BC about. Something maybe a little bit, I might be able to do a series on. It's a little bit interesting, like kind of the origins of these things, right? Going back before the PC 98. Oh well. So if you watched all that, thank you for watching it. That's the end of this play. This is the end of The Greatest Attorney. And I guess I'll get back to work finishing off the other things I need to finish off.